The encounter at the airport. Roberto Alvarez stood by the massive glass windows of the Madrid International Airport's VIP lounge. The city shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, a blend of historic charm and modern ambition, much like the man himself. At 42, Roberto was the name behind some of Europe's most innovative architectural designs. From eco-friendly skyscrapers to award-winning community housing projects, his genius was unquestionable. Yet behind the polished facade, an emptiness he couldn't quite define lingered. His assistant approached, discreetly handing him an espresso. "Your flight to Milan has been delayed, Senor Alvarez," she informed him. Roberto nodded, dismissing her politely. He wasn't particularly perturbed. Delays were part of the jet-setting lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to. His eyes wandered over the bustling crowd below the lounge. Families said their goodbyes, business people checked their devices, and tourists clutched their passports. In the sea of strangers, something, or rather, someone, caught his attention. It wasn't a mere glance, it was a jolt, a visceral reaction that froze time. Standing by gate 23 was a woman he hadn't seen in almost 2 decades. She had changed, of course. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with hints of gray. But her posture, the way she stood with quiet confidence, it was unmistakable. Carmen. His breath hitched. Memories of late nights in Barcelona flooded his mind. Their endless debates about life and ambition, her melodic laughter, the way her eyes sparkled with curiosity. She had been his anchor, his dream partner, until everything unraveled. He had chosen his career over her, believing time and distance would resolve itself. It hadn't. But what truly shook him wasn't Carmen alone. It was the 3 teenagers standing beside her. Tall and lean, they bore striking features he couldn't ignore. The sharp jawlines, the piercing dark eyes, the unmistakable dimple in their chins. They looked just like him. Roberto leaned forward, his heart pounding. Were they her sons? His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Carmen hadn't remarried, at least not to his knowledge. The resemblance was uncanny. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the absurdity of his thoughts. Coincidences happen, right? But then one of the boys turned, catching Roberto's eye. It was like staring into a mirror of his younger self. The boys browsed furrowed briefly before he turned back to his brothers, unaware of the turmoil he'd just ignited. Roberto's pulse quickened. He grabbed his bag and made his way toward the gate, weaving through travelers and their luggage. As he approached, Carmen glanced in his direction. Her eyes widened, recognition flashing across her face. She froze for a moment, her composed expression faltering, before quickly regaining her poise. "Carmen," Roberto said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Roberto." Her tone was calm but guarded, as if bracing for an onslaught of questions. "It's been a long time," he managed, though the words felt inadequate for the tidal wave of emotions crashing over him. She nodded, her eyes flickering toward the boys, who were now staring at him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "It has." Roberto hesitated, his gaze shifting back to the teenagers. "Who are they?" For a moment, Carmen didn't respond. Then, with a sigh, she answered, "Miguel, Diego, and Javier. My sons." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. "My sons." The possessive pronoun seemed deliberate, yet it did nothing to quell Roberto's suspicions. Before he could press further, the airport intercom announced boarding for their flight. "Excuse me," Carmen said, stepping around him and guiding her sons toward the gate. "We need to go." "Wait." Roberto's voice cracked, desperation lacing his tone. But she didn't stop, and the boys followed her without a backward glance. He stood there, frozen, as the reality of the encounter sank in. Sons, plural, and all 3 bore his face. The storm of emotions, shock, anger, disbelief, consumed him. Carmen's departure years ago had been abrupt, leaving him with unanswered questions and a void he had never managed to fill. Now it seemed those questions were about to resurface with a vengeance. Roberto fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling. He dialed the number of his assistant. "Claudia," he said, his voice barely steady. "Reschedule everything. I need time to sort something out." For the first time in years, Roberto Alvarez, the man who controlled every aspect of his meticulously crafted life, felt completely unmoored. What had Carmen hidden from him? And why? The confrontation. The streets of Seville were alive with music and chatter as Roberto Alvarez's car weaved through the narrow, sunlit lanes. The ornate architecture of the city seemed to mock him, buildings full of stories that stood the test of time, while his own life felt like it was crumbling under the weight of unspoken truths. Roberto had spent the previous night replaying every detail of his unexpected encounter with Carmen and the three teenagers who looked like younger versions of him. Sleep had been impossible. Questions churned in his mind like a storm, and the only way to find clarity was to face Carmen directly. A few phone calls and a bit of resourceful searching led him to a modest art gallery tucked in the heart of Seville. Carmen worked there as a curator and art instructor, her passion for creativity still alive after all these years. His driver pulled up outside the gallery, and Roberto hesitated, his hand lingering on the door handle. For a man who thrived on confidence and control, the prospect of this confrontation unnerved him. But he wasn't just here for answers. He was here to reclaim a piece of himself that had been lost. The gallery was a stark contrast to Roberto's sleek, modern world. It exuded warmth and history, with textured walls and vibrant canvases that spoke of life, struggle, and joy. A soft hum of voices drifted from a back room where a class was in progress. Following the sound, he stepped into a sunlit studio. Carmen stood at the center of a semicircle of students, her hands animated as she explained the intricacies of brushstrokes. Her voice was calm, steady, a voice he remembered well. But now, it was tinged with an authority that spoke of years of experience and self-assurance. "Carmen," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a sharp blade. The students turned to look at him, their curiosity palpable. Carmen froze mid-sentence, her back to him, before slowly turning around. Her face was a mixture of surprise and resignation. She dismissed the class with a quick, "We'll continue this next week," and the students filed out, leaving the two of them alone. "What are you doing here, Roberto?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. "I think you know why I'm here," he replied, his tone measured but laced with tension. "We need to talk." Carmen sighed, gesturing toward a quiet corner of the gallery. They walked in silence, the distance between them filled with years of unresolved emotions. She led him to a bench near a window, the soft glow of sunlight painting her features. "Go ahead," she said, sitting down. "Ask what you came to ask." Roberto didn't waste time. "Those boys, Miguel, Diego, and Javier, are they mine?" Her jaw tightened, and she looked away, as though gathering her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with an edge of vulnerability. "Yes, they're your sons." The words struck him like a thunderclap. He had expected the answer, but hearing it aloud felt different. Real, irrefutable. His chest tightened as he struggled to process the revelation. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why did you keep them from me?" Carmen met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and defiance. "Because you had already made your choice, Roberto. You chose your career, your ambition, your skyscrapers. There was no room in your life for me, let alone a family." "That's not fair," he snapped. "You made that decision for me. You disappeared without a word, without giving me a chance." "A chance?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "You were building your empire, Roberto. You didn't have time for anything else. I wasn't going to beg you to stay, and I certainly wasn't going to ask you to sacrifice your dreams for children you didn't know existed." Her words hit him hard, and he realized the truth in them. He had been consumed by his ambition back then, chasing success with tunnel vision. But that didn't make the betrayal sting any less. "They're teenagers now," he said, his voice softer. "I've missed so much of their lives. Their first steps, their first words, everything." Carmen's expression softened, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "It wasn't an easy decision, Roberto. I've carried this secret for 15 years. Do you think I didn't wonder if I was doing the right thing? If I was being selfish?" "You were," he said bluntly. "You denied me the chance to know them, to be a father." "And what kind of father would you have been?" She shot back, her voice trembling. "You were barely present in our relationship. How could I trust you to be present for them?" The words cut deep, but Roberto couldn't deny them. The man he had been 15 years ago wouldn't have been ready for fatherhood. But he wasn't that man anymore. "I want to meet them," he said firmly. "I want to know them. I deserve that much." Carmen hesitated, her gaze searching his face. She seemed to weigh her options, her emotions flickering across her features like a shifting tide. Finally, she nodded. "Fine, but don't expect them to accept you right away. They don't know you, Roberto. To them, you're just a stranger. I'll take whatever I can get," he replied. The next day, Roberto found himself standing in a small park on the outskirts of the city. Carmen had agreed to bring the boys there for a casual meeting, but the weight of the moment felt anything but casual. He watched as they approached, a family of 4, with Carmen leading the way. Miguel, the eldest, walked with a confident stride, his sharp features set in a mask of indifference. Diego, the middle son, exuded a restless energy, his hands stuffed into his pockets and his eyes darting around the park. Javier, the youngest, lingered slightly behind, clutching a sketchbook to his chest. Carmen stopped a few feet away, her expression neutral. "Boys, this is Roberto, your father." The tension in the air was palpable. Miguel was the first to speak, his voice cool and clipped. "So, you're the guy." Roberto winced at the hostility in his tone, but nodded. "Yes, I am." Diego crossed his arms, his gaze sharp and challenging. "Why now? Why bother showing up after all this time?" Roberto took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Because I didn't know. If I had, I would have been here." Javier, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke, his voice soft but laced with curiosity. "Why didn't she tell you?" Roberto glanced at Carmen, who looked away, her expression guarded. "That's a question only your mother can answer," he said gently. "But I'm here now, and I want to get to know you, all of you." The boys exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. Miguel scoffed. "Well, it's a little late for that, don't you think?" "Maybe it is," Roberto admitted, "but I'm not going anywhere. I'll prove myself to you, however long it takes." Carmen watched silently as the boys processed his words. It wasn't a warm reunion, but it was a start, a fragile beginning to what Roberto hoped would be a long journey toward healing and connection. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a golden glow, Roberto felt a flicker of hope. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to rebuild what had been lost. He had been a builder his entire life, of structures, of legacies. Now he was ready to build something far more important, a family. Bridges made of glass. The wind swept through the coastal town of Seville as Roberto Alvarez drove along the narrow streets, a rental car navigating his unfamiliar surroundings. The past few days had left him reeling. 3 sons he never knew existed, a woman he had once loved who had chosen to keep them hidden, and an overwhelming sense of guilt and responsibility. He wasn't a man used to being on unstable ground, but here he was, struggling to find footing. Ahead of him, the address Carmen had given him came into view. It was a modest 2-story house with a vibrant garden spilling over the fence. In stark contrast to Roberto's sterile penthouse in Madrid, the home radiated warmth and life. He parked, took a deep breath, and stepped out. As he approached the door, his heart pounded. He wasn't here to negotiate a deal or close a business contract. He was here to face the 3 young men whose lives he had unknowingly missed. The door opened before he could knock, revealing Javier. the youngest of the boys. The teenager was shorter than his brothers, but had an air of quiet intensity. A sketchbook was tucked under his arm, and his expression was one of cautious curiosity. "Mom said you'd be here," Javier said, stepping aside to let Roberto in. Roberto hesitated. "Thank you. I appreciate it." The boy nodded silently and walked toward the living room, leaving Roberto to follow. Inside, the house was cozy, filled with mismatched furniture, vibrant artwork, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Carmen stood in the kitchen, her back to him as she stirred a pot on the stove. The other two boys, Miguel and Diego, sat on the couch, their postures radiating varying degrees of resistance and indifference. Carmen turned, her face neutral but her voice calm. "You're early. I didn't want to miss the chance to talk to them," Roberto replied, his eyes flicking toward the boys. "Well," Carmen said, motioning toward the living room, "they're all yours. But don't expect much. They're not the most trusting right now." Miguel, the eldest, folded his arms across his chest. His piercing gaze made Roberto feel like he was under a microscope. "So, what do you want, exactly?" Roberto took a deep breath and sat on the edge of an armchair across from them. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "I want to know you. That's all. I missed so much of your lives, and I don't expect to make up for it overnight. But I'm here, and I want to try." Diego, the middle son, scoffed and leaned back on the couch, crossing his legs. "You don't just show up after 15 years and expect us to act like it's fine. We've done just fine without you." "I understand how you feel," Roberto said, keeping his voice steady. "And you're right. I can't change the past. But I can be here now. That's all I'm asking for, a chance." Javier, who had been quiet, looked up from his sketchbook. "Why didn't you know about us?" The question lingered in the air, directed at both Roberto and Carmen. Carmen sighed and walked into the room, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Because I made a choice," she said, her voice firm. "I thought I was doing what was best for all of us." "That's a cop-out," Miguel snapped, glaring at her. "You didn't even give him a chance to decide." Carmen's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, her expression stoic. Roberto felt the tension growing and decided to step in. "Your mother made the best decision she could with the information she had," he said, his voice calm. "But that doesn't mean I'm not responsible for the choices I made back then. I wasn't the man I should have been. I was too focused on my career, on my goals. But I'm here now, and I want to build something with all of you, whatever that looks like." Miguel narrowed his eyes, his skepticism unrelenting. "It's not that easy. You can't just walk in here and expect us to trust you." "I don't expect that," Roberto replied. "Trust isn't something I can ask for. It's something I have to earn." Diego leaned forward, his expression suddenly serious. "So, how are you planning to earn it?" Roberto hesitated, caught off guard by the direct question. He looked around the room, taking in the details, the sketches on the walls, the books piled on the shelves, the soccer cleats near the door. These were pieces of their lives, glimpses of who they were. He needed to start there. "I'd like to spend time with each of you," Roberto said. "I want to understand what's important to you, what you care about." Miguel's lip curled slightly in a skeptical smirk. "Sounds like a corporate pitch." "I'm not pitching anything," Roberto said. "I'm just trying to figure out how to connect with my sons." The following days were anything but smooth. Miguel, the eldest, remained guarded, his sharp mind constantly probing Roberto's motives. Diego, fiery and outspoken, challenged him at every turn. Only Javier showed glimpses of openness, though even he kept his distance. One afternoon, Roberto found Javier sitting in the garden, sketching. The boy didn't acknowledge his presence at first, his pencil gliding across the page in swift, deliberate strokes. Roberto crouched beside him, careful not to intrude. "That's really good," Roberto said softly, nodding toward the sketch. Javier glanced at him briefly before returning to his work. "Thanks." "Do you want to be an artist?" Roberto asked. Javier shrugged. "Maybe. I like it." Roberto sat on the grass, folding his legs beneath him. "I used to sketch, too. Buildings, mostly. That's how I started in architecture." For the first time, Javier looked up, his interest piqued. "You drew your buildings?" "Every single one," Roberto replied with a small smile. "There's something about putting ideas on paper. It makes them feel real." Javier hesitated, then handed Roberto the sketchbook. "What do you think?" Roberto flipped through the pages, his admiration growing with each drawing. The sketches were intricate and full of emotion. Landscapes, portraits, abstract designs. "These are incredible, Javier. You have real talent." The boy's cheeks flushed slightly, but he quickly looked away. "Thanks." It was a small moment, but for Roberto, it felt like progress. With Miguel, the breakthrough came unexpectedly. One evening, Roberto found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a chessboard. The pieces were arranged mid-game, as though frozen in time. "Do you play?" Roberto asked, pulling out a chair. Miguel glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "Do you?" "I used to," Roberto replied. "But it's been years. Mind if I join?" Miguel hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." The game was tense, a silent battle of wits and strategy. Miguel played aggressively, testing Roberto's limits, but Roberto held his ground. By the time the game ended in a draw, Miguel's expression had softened slightly. "You're not bad," Miguel admitted. "You're better," Roberto replied with a smile. "But I'll get you next time." Miguel smirked, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "We'll see." Diego was the toughest nut to crack. His anger was a shield, and he wielded it like a weapon. But Roberto was determined to break through. One morning, he showed up unannounced at Diego's soccer game. The boy's surprise was evident, but he quickly masked it with his usual bravado. On the field, Diego was unstoppable, his energy and determination unmatched. Roberto couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. After the game, Roberto approached him cautiously. "You're amazing out there." Diego shrugged, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Thanks. I'd love to come to more of your games," Roberto said, "if that's okay with you." Diego's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "So you can feel better about yourself." "No," Roberto replied honestly, "because I want to support you. That's all." Diego stared at him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Fine, but don't expect me to go easy on you." "I wouldn't dream of it," Roberto said with a grin. Little by little, Roberto began to carve out a place in their lives. The road was long and trust was fragile, but he was determined. For the first time, his focus wasn't on building skyscrapers or winning awards. It was on building something far more important, a relationship with his sons. Tensions and turning points. The morning air in Seville was crisp, filled with the mingling scents of blooming jasmine and freshly baked bread from a nearby panaderia. Roberto Alvarez stepped out of his rental car, carrying a small bag. Inside were gifts, not grand, expensive gestures, but small, thoughtful tokens he hoped would help bridge the gap with his sons. He had spent the past week trying to connect with Miguel, Diego, and Javier. Each of them posed a unique challenge, and the invisible walls they had built were as imposing as the skyscrapers he once designed. Today, Roberto had planned something special, a family outing to the local history museum. It wasn't glamorous, but it was neutral ground, and he hoped it might foster some understanding, or at least break the ice further. When he arrived at the house, Carmen was waiting at the door, her arms crossed, and a skeptical look on her face. She raised an eyebrow as he approached. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," she said. "I have to be," Roberto replied with a faint smile. "This isn't exactly easy." She stepped aside to let him in. Inside, the atmosphere was already tense. Miguel sat at the dining table, scrolling through his phone with the kind of indifference that was far from accidental. Diego leaned against the kitchen counter, his arms folded, watching Roberto like he was a predator circling prey. Javier sat cross-legged on the couch, sketching something in his ever-present notebook. Roberto cleared his throat, addressing all of them. "Good morning. I thought we could spend some time together today. There's a museum exhibit on Andalusian history. I think you might find it interesting." Diego snorted, not bothering to hide his disdain. "A museum? Seriously? That's your big idea?" Miguel didn't even look up from his phone. "Pass." Javier glanced at Carmen, as if silently asking for permission, but said nothing. Roberto sighed. "Look, I know this isn't exactly exciting, but it's a chance for us to do something together. Just give me a couple of hours. If it's terrible, you can all hold it against me later." Carmen stepped in, her voice firm. "You should go. All of you. He's making an effort, and the least you can do is meet him halfway." Miguel groaned but stood up, shoving his phone into his pocket. Diego rolled his eyes but grabbed his jacket. Javier, as usual, followed without complaint. It wasn't enthusiasm, but it was a start. The museum was a sprawling, ornate building nestled in the heart of Seville, its architecture a testament to centuries of cultural evolution. As they walked through the grand entrance, Roberto couldn't help but feel a twinge of nostalgia. He had once loved places like this, where history and design intersected, telling stories of people and places long gone. Miguel trailed behind, his disinterest palpable, while Diego's expression made it clear he'd rather be anywhere else. Only Javier seemed remotely engaged, his eyes darting around as he sketched parts of the intricate mosaics lining the walls. The group paused in front of a display on Moorish architecture, and Roberto couldn't resist the urge to share some knowledge. "Did you know that many of the techniques used in these designs are still influencing modern architecture today? Look at the balance between form and function. The arches, the symmetry. It's beautiful and practical." Diego smirked. "Yeah, great, if you like old buildings." "They're not just old buildings," Roberto replied patiently. "They're pieces of history. They tell stories about the people who lived here, their beliefs, their struggles." Miguel finally spoke, his tone sharp. "So, is that what you're trying to do now? Build some kind of story with us? Because you missed the first 15 years. The word stung, but Roberto forced himself to stay calm. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your lives now. I want to understand who you are, what matters to you." Diego crossed his arms. "What matters to me? Showing up when it counts, not after everything's already done." Carmen, who had been watching from a distance, stepped in. "Enough," she said, her tone firm. "This isn't helping anyone." The boys fell silent, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud. Later, as they exited the museum, Roberto noticed Javier lagging behind, still scribbling in his notebook. He slowed his pace to walk beside him. "What are you drawing?" Roberto asked. Javier hesitated, then showed him the page. It was a sketch of one of the intricate archways from the exhibit, but with a modern twist, bold lines, and geometric patterns that gave it a futuristic feel. "This is incredible," Roberto said, genuinely impressed. "You have a real eye for detail." Javier shrugged. "It's just something I do." "It's more than that," Roberto insisted. "Have you ever thought about architecture? You could design buildings that tell stories, just like the ones we saw today." The boy's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Roberto saw a glimmer of connection. "Maybe," Javier said quietly. The drive back to the house was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. When they arrived, the boys disappeared into their rooms without a word. Carmen leaned against the kitchen counter, watching Roberto with a mix of curiosity and caution. "You're not making it easy on yourself," she said. "It's not supposed to be easy," Roberto replied. "But I'm not giving up." She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "They're stubborn, like their father." Roberto chuckled, though the weight of her words wasn't lost on him. "It'll take time. but I'm willing to put in the work. That evening, a breakthrough came in the most unexpected way. Roberto was sitting on the back patio, nursing a glass of wine, when Diego emerged from the house. The boy hesitated, then sat down across from him. "You really don't give up, do you?" Diego asked. "Not when it matters," Roberto replied. Diego was quiet for a moment, then said, "You want to know what matters to me? Mom. She did everything for us. Worked 3 jobs, sacrificed everything, just to make sure we had what we needed. She didn't have time to chase dreams or build skyscrapers. She was there every single day." Roberto's chest tightened. "I know she gave up a lot, and I know I can't ever repay her for that. But I want to honor what she did by being here now, by trying to make up for lost time." Diego's gaze softened, though his defenses didn't fully drop. "We'll see," he said, standing up. "But don't think one museum trip is going to fix everything." "I wouldn't dream of it," Roberto replied with a faint smile. That night, as Roberto lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he felt a small sense of hope. The walls were still there, but cracks had started to form. For the first time, he felt like he was making progress, not as a businessman, not as an architect, but as a father. The road ahead was long, but he was ready to walk it. For Miguel, Diego, and Javier, he would do whatever it took to prove he wasn't just a man who built skyscrapers. He could build bridges too, even if they were fragile and made of glass. Cracks in the foundation. The early morning light streamed through the windows of Carmen's modest kitchen, casting a golden glow on the worn wooden table. Roberto sat there nursing a cup of coffee, his thoughts clouded with the events of the past few days. Progress with his sons had been slow, uneven, and filled with moments of tension that left him questioning everything. Yet he refused to walk away. He had built his career on overcoming impossible challenges, but this, rebuilding a family, was proving to be the hardest blueprint he had ever tackled. The sound of the back door opening broke his reverie. Carmen entered, her hair tied back, carrying a basket of fresh produce from the local market. She set it down on the counter and glanced at him. "You're up early," she said, unpacking the basket. "Couldn't sleep." "Something like that," Roberto replied, his voice heavy. "I keep going over everything in my head, trying to figure out how to make it work with them." Carmen paused, then turned to face him. "Roberto, you can't rush this. They'd had 15 years of growing up without you. A few days, or even weeks, won't erase that. It's going to take time." "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair, "but it feels like every step forward comes with 2 steps back." "That's part of the process," she said softly, "and part of being a parent." The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Roberto had spent his life avoiding messy emotions, focusing instead on the clean lines of his buildings and the clarity of his designs. But family wasn't something you could draft on paper. It was messy, unpredictable, and full of cracks. Later that day, Roberto decided to take a more personal approach with each of his sons. The museum outing had been a mixed success, and he realized that trying to engage all 3 boys at once wasn't the best strategy. They were individuals, each with their own walls to break down. His first focus was Miguel, the eldest. Roberto had observed Miguel's sharp intellect and strategic thinking during their chess game, but their conversations had remained surface level. Miguel was a natural leader, but his skepticism toward Roberto ran deep. Roberto found him in the backyard, sitting under the shade of an old oak tree with a book in hand. Miguel barely acknowledged his presence as Roberto approached and sat down beside him. "What are you reading?" Roberto asked. "Politics and economics," Miguel replied without looking up. "It's for a class project." "You're studying political science?" Roberto asked, genuinely curious. "International relations," Miguel corrected. "I want to work for a nonprofit someday. Maybe something focused on sustainability or global policy." Roberto smiled, impressed. "That's an admirable goal, and it makes sense. You've always struck me as someone who sees the bigger picture. Miguel finally looked up, his expression unreadable. It's funny, isn't it? How I want to fix the world, but I can't even figure out what to do with you. The comment hit like a punch, but Roberto forced himself to stay composed. You don't have to figure it out right now. I just want you to know that I'm here for you, whatever you need, and I'm proud of what you're doing. Miguel didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps a crack in the wall he had built. Roberto didn't press further, knowing that small victories were still victories. With Diego, the middle son, the challenge was different. Diego's fiery temperament and sarcasm often acted as a shield, but Roberto knew there was more to him than met the eye. He decided to approach Diego on his turf, the soccer field. Roberto arrived unannounced at one of Diego's evening practices. The field buzzed with energy as players darted back and forth, their shouts blending with the sound of the ball striking cleats. Diego was in his element, his passion and skill on full display. When the practice ended, Roberto approached him, carrying a water bottle. Diego's eyes narrowed as he saw him. "What are you doing here?" Diego asked, his tone defensive. "I wanted to see you play," Roberto said simply. "You're incredible out there." Diego rolled his eyes. "You don't have to butter me up, you know." "I'm not," Roberto replied. "I mean it. You've got real talent." Diego hesitated, then took the water bottle. "Thanks." They stood in silence for a moment before Roberto spoke again. "You know, I wasn't much of an athlete growing up. I was more of a bookworm. But I admire your drive. It's not easy to lead a team like that." Diego shrugged, but there was a faint hint of pride in his expression. "It's not just about leading. It's about knowing when to push and when to step back." "Wise words," Roberto said with a smile. "Maybe you can teach me a thing or two about that." Diego smirked, his defenses lowering slightly. "Maybe." Javier, the youngest, was the easiest to approach, but also the hardest to truly reach. His quiet, introspective nature made him an enigma. Roberto found him at the piano one evening, his fingers dancing over the keys in a melancholic melody. "That's beautiful," Roberto said, leaning against the doorway. Javier glanced at him but didn't stop playing. "It's just something I've been working on." "Do you write your own music often?" Roberto asked, stepping into the room. "Sometimes," Javier replied. "It helps me think." "Would you mind playing it for me?" Roberto asked. Javier hesitated, then nodded. He started the piece again, this time with more confidence. The music was hauntingly beautiful, filled with emotion that spoke louder than words. When he finished, Roberto clapped softly. "You have a gift, Javier. Have you ever thought about sharing your music with others?" Javier shrugged. "I don't know. It's just personal." "I understand," Roberto said. "But sometimes the things that are most personal are the things that resonate with people the most." Javier gave a small smile, the first genuine one Roberto had seen. Maybe. The days that followed were a mix of progress and setbacks. For every step forward, there were moments of doubt and frustration. Miguel's sharp words, Diego's fiery outbursts, and Javier's guarded demeanor tested Roberto's patience, but he refused to give up. One evening, the family gathered for dinner. The conversation was stilted at first, but slowly it began to flow. Miguel shared a story about a heated debate in his international relations class. Diego teased him mercilessly, while Javier quietly sketched the scene on a napkin. Roberto watched them, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. These were his sons, smart, passionate, and full of potential. He might never be able to make up for the years he missed, but he could be there for the years ahead. As the night wore on, Carmen caught his eye and smiled. It was a small, fleeting moment, but it spoke volumes. She saw his effort, his determination, and his love for the boys. And for the first time, Roberto felt like he was no longer standing on shaky ground. The foundation of their family was still fragile, but it was holding. and that was enough to keep building. A new foundation. The autumn breeze carried a crispness that hinted at the changing seasons as Roberto Alvarez stood at the edge of a construction site in the small town of Algeraf, just outside Seville. But this was no ordinary project. The blueprint in his hands wasn't just another testament to his architectural prowess. It was a collaboration, a family effort. For the first time, he wasn't building for acclaim or awards. He was building for something far more personal, his family's future. The site buzzed with activity, but what drew his attention was the sight of his sons working alongside him. Miguel stood with a clipboard, directing the logistics team with the same sharp focus he displayed in chess. Diego, wearing a hard hat, moved among the workers, capturing moments with his camera for a story he was crafting for his school's online journal. Javier sat on a nearby bench, sketching yet another of his inspired designs, his notebook filled with ideas that Roberto had started incorporating into the project. This wasn't just a housing complex. It was a sustainable community center designed to serve the town, a place for families to gather, children to play, and creativity to flourish. And while the building itself would stand as a monument to innovation, what it symbolized for Roberto was far greater. It was a symbol of hope, reconciliation, and the bonds that he was determined to strengthen. As the workday wound down, Carmen arrived with a basket of food, her presence commanding attention even amid the organized chaos. She waved at the boys, who greeted her warmly, before making her way to Roberto. "You're really doing it," she said, handing him a thermos of coffee. "I wasn't sure you'd follow through." Roberto chuckled, taking a sip. "You should know by now that I don't give up easily." Carmen's smile was tinged with something softer than usual. Pride, maybe, or a cautious acknowledgement of how far he had come. "They're starting to see it too, you know. The effort you're putting in." "Good," he said, glancing at his sons. "Because I'm not stopping." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the boys interacted with the workers. Miguel's calm authority, Diego's fiery energy, and Javier's quiet creativity. It was a dynamic that amazed Roberto every time he saw it. They were so different, yet so united by the common threads of family and resilience. That evening, back at Carmen's house, the family gathered around the dining table. The meal was simple but satisfying, a hearty stew that Carmen had perfected over the years. Conversation flowed more easily now, the awkward silences of their earlier days replaced with laughter and shared stories. Miguel spoke about an upcoming debate in his international relations class, his enthusiasm lighting up his usually reserved demeanor. Diego regaled them with tales from the soccer field, his natural storytelling captivating even his brothers. Javier, who rarely spoke much, shared a small but touching moment when one of his teachers praised his art. Roberto listened intently, his heart swelling with pride. These were his sons, 3 incredible young men who had grown up strong, intelligent, and compassionate, despite the pain of his absence. He knew he couldn't take credit for their strength. That was Carmen's doing, but he hoped to contribute to their lives in meaningful ways now. At one point during dinner, Diego set his fork down and looked directly at Roberto. "So what happens after this project is done? Are you going to stay, or will you go back to Madrid?" The question hung in the air, and Roberto could feel the weight of it pressing on everyone in the room. It wasn't just about geography. It was about commitment. "I'm not going anywhere," Roberto said firmly, meeting Diego's gaze. "This is where I belong now, with all of you." Miguel raised an eyebrow. "And what about your career? All those skyscrapers and international deals?" Roberto smiled, his tone resolute. "My career will always be there, but it doesn't define me anymore. You do. This family does." Javier, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, spoke up softly. "So, this isn't just temporary?" "No," Roberto said, his voice steady. "It's not temporary. I've spent too much of my life chasing things that don't matter as much as this. I'm done running. I want to be here for every soccer game, every debate, every piano recital." For all of it. Carmen's eyes glistened with unshed tears, though she quickly blinked them away. "That's good to hear," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As the weeks passed, the family grew closer, their bonds strengthened through shared experiences. Roberto made good on his promise, attending Miguel's debates and helping him refine his arguments late into the night. He showed up to every one of Diego's soccer games, cheering louder than anyone else on the sidelines. And with Javier, he spent hours poring over sketches and music compositions, encouraging his youngest son to pursue his dreams without hesitation. Carmen watched these changes with a mix of relief and cautious optimism. She had spent so many years carrying the burden of raising their sons alone, and now, seeing Roberto shoulder that responsibility with such determination, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. But more than that, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for her boys, but for herself. The grand opening of the community center marked a pivotal moment for the family. The project had been a labor of love, with each member of the family contributing in their own way. On the day of the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the town gathered to celebrate, and Roberto stood on the stage, flanked by his sons and Carmen. As he addressed the crowd, his voice carried a sincerity that resonated with everyone present. "This building is more than just a structure. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together, when we combine our strengths, our creativity, and our compassion. And for me, it's a reminder that the most important things in life aren't built with steel and glass. They're built with love, trust, and second chances." The crowd erupted into applause, but Roberto's focus was on his family. Miguel stood tall, a faint smile on his lips. Diego gave him a thumbs up, his fiery energy momentarily subdued by pride. Javier, ever the quiet one, simply nodded, his expression filled with warmth. And Carmen, standing beside him, reached out and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. That evening, back at the house, the family gathered around the fire pit in the backyard. The flames crackled as they roasted marshmallows and shared stories, the warmth of the fire mirrored by the warmth in their hearts. Roberto looked around at his sons, his heart full in a way he had never experienced before. "I know I've said this before," he began, his voice steady but emotional, "but I want to thank you for giving me a chance, for letting me be part of your lives." Diego grinned. "You're not off the hook yet, old man." Miguel smirked. "Yeah, you've still got a lot to prove." Javier chuckled softly, his usual shyness momentarily giving way. "But you're doing okay so far." Carmen laughed, her gaze filled with a mixture of pride and affection. "They're right, you know. You've come a long way, Roberto." He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm not stopping. Not ever." As the fire crackled and the stars emerged one by one, Roberto felt a sense of peace he had never known. For years, he had built towers that touched the sky, but now he had built something far more enduring, a family bound by love, forgiveness, and the promise of a better future. And this time, he knew the foundation was strong. The crackling fire dwindled to glowing embers, casting soft shadows across the backyard. The warmth of the flames mirrored the warmth in Roberto's heart, but he knew this wasn't the end of his journey. It was only the beginning of a life he had nearly lost but was now reclaiming. The boys were teasing one another, Diego recounting an embarrassing moment from Miguel's last debate, and Javier sketching them both in exaggerated comical poses. Their laughter filled the air, light and unburdened. It was a sound Roberto didn't realize he had been longing for until now. He glanced at Carmen, who sat beside him with a serene expression. Her eyes reflected the firelight, and for the first time in years, they seemed free of the guardedness she had carried for so long. It was a look Roberto hadn't seen since their days in Barcelona, back when they had both been young and full of dreams. "Thank you," Roberto said softly, his voice barely audible over the boys' laughter. Carmen turned to him, a question in her eyes. "For what?" "For everything," he replied. "For raising them, for being their rock when I wasn't there, and for letting me back into their lives." She smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "It wasn't easy, and I didn't do it perfectly. But they're good boys." "They are," Roberto agreed. "And that's because of you." Carmen's smile faltered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've come a long way, Roberto. But they're still finding their way, too. Be patient with them." "I will," he promised. "For as long as it takes." The weeks that followed were filled with moments that cemented the family's bond. Roberto continued to show up for his sons in ways they hadn't expected. He helped Miguel prepare for a major presentation in his international relations class, providing insights from his own experiences in negotiation and strategy. They worked late into the night, and when Miguel nailed his presentation, the pride in his father's eyes was undeniable. For Diego, it was about consistency. Roberto attended every soccer game, no matter how small or inconvenient. He cheered loudly from the sidelines, becoming a familiar presence that Diego could count on. Over time, Diego's sharp edges softened, and their conversations grew more personal. One day, after a particularly tough loss, Diego confided in Roberto about the pressure he felt to succeed, and Roberto listened without judgment. With Javier, their connection grew quietly but deeply. They often spent evenings sketching together, Roberto showing him old architectural designs, while Javier shared his evolving ideas for futuristic landscapes and characters. One day, Javier shyly handed Roberto a sketch of the community center they had built, reimagined with a fantastical, dreamlike twist. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the trust that had formed between them. The holidays arrived, bringing with them a sense of warmth and celebration. Carmen's house was filled with decorations, the scent of cinnamon and pine filling the air. For the first time in years, the boys seemed genuinely excited. Roberto had planned a surprise, a trip to the mountains for a week of skiing, sledding, and quality time away from the demands of everyday life. On Christmas morning, as the family sat around the tree opening gifts, Javier handed Roberto a small wrapped package. It was unassuming, but the weight of the gesture wasn't lost on him. "What's this?" Roberto asked, his curiosity piqued. "Just open it," Javier said, his cheeks flushing. Inside was a framed sketch, a portrait of the entire family, drawn with Javier's meticulous attention to detail. It showed Miguel's serious expression, Diego's mischievous grin, Javier's thoughtful demeanor, Carmen's warmth, and Roberto himself, smiling in a way he hadn't realized he could. It was a simple but powerful representation of what they had become. "It's beautiful," Roberto said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Javier." The boy shrugged, but his small smile spoke volumes. "I figured it was time you had something to remind you of us." Roberto met his son's gazes, his heart full. "I don't need a reminder. You're always with me." As the new year approached, Roberto found himself reflecting on how far they had come. The community center was thriving, a symbol of the family's shared efforts and a beacon for the town. But more importantly, the bonds between them had grown strong, rooted in trust and love. On New Year's Eve, the family gathered in the backyard again, this time to watch the fireworks. The boys joked and teased one another, their laughter ringing out into the crisp night air. Carmen stood beside Roberto, her arms crossed against the chill, and he offered her his jacket. As the first burst of fireworks lit up the sky, Roberto turned to her. "I don't know how to thank you for this chance, Carmen." "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "Just keep showing up. That's all any of us need." "I will," he said, his voice steady with conviction. And as the fireworks painted the night with vibrant colors, Roberto knew that he had finally built something truly enduring. Not a skyscraper, not a monument, but a family. A foundation made of love, trust, and second chances. And this time, he was determined to keep it standing for the rest of his life.